Friends groups like to share appreciation and understanding of the natural environment, so often run walks with experts from volunteer groups such as the Latrobe Valley Field Naturalists.
The ferns are a very old type of plant. They predate the dinosaurs and the flowering plants. At Mount Worth there are lots of ferns, and they vary from the big tree ferns down to tiny little filmy ferns, and lots of ferns in between. You can see here all these tree ferns growing up the hill. They're the rough tree ferns, so there are two types of tree ferns, the rough tree fern and the soft tree fern, and from this distance you wouldn't know what they were. And the tree ferns were used for food by the Indigenous people. They used the starch inside the trunk, and they could eat it raw or they could cook it. One of the lovely features of the tree ferns is the way the new fronds uncurl. So in the centre you have these lovely curled fronds, and they're called a fiddle, and they uncurl to make the new frond, and you do get that on some other ferns, but it's very noticeable on the tree ferns. When we entered the park from the car park, when it was a lot drier than in this moist gully, they were all rough tree ferns. And the ferns we've been walking through that have been covered with the filmy ferns, they're the soft tree ferns. And here we have an example of two together. So the rough tree fern here, you can see it's got bases of the old fronds that are still on the fern. You can easily feel, if you run your finger over it, how rough it is. And it's the same with the fronds. Now this is an example of the soft tree fern, and it does have the bases of the old fronds on it, but they're covered in these soft roots. And if you feel the stems of the fronds, they're nice and soft, nice and smooth. They're covered with soft hairs. The other fern that I would point out is this mother shield fern, and you can see it growing all along the ground here, covering the ground. And the reason it's called a mother shield fern is because it has little baby ferns on the end of it, and when these ferns grow bigger, the frond drops down on the ground and they plant themselves. So you get these extensive colonies. So here's an example of the filmy ferns. These are the smallest ferns, and they only grow in places that are moist nearly all the time. And they normally grow on tree fern trunks, but this particular species likes to grow on dogwood. And there are actually 4 species of filmy fern in the park, which is really good. You often don't get that diversity, but that's an example of the tiny little ferns that grow on the trunks of things. The other fern here is the kangaroo fern, and it's an epiphytic fern. So an epiphyte grows on something, but it doesn't get its nutrients from it. The kangaroo fern is called the kangaroo fern because you'll see the fronds here. You've got single ones like that, and the big ones have lots of, they're called pinnules, these side branches, so they've got lots of pinnules, but this particular one resembles a kangaroo's footprint with the one toe out the side, so that's why it's called the kangaroo fern. And they don't just grow on trees, they'll grow on rocks, and they can even grow on the ground. You can grow them in a pot. They grow on lots of things that are moist and mossy and climb up them.
As mentioned earlier, ferns evolve before flowers and seeds, so reproduce by spores, which can be seen on the back of fronds in these little sacs.
Good example of a filmy fern growing on the trunk of the tree fern, which is where they typically grow. And this one is actually a different species to the one that we saw earlier. Filmy ferns are usually about 1 cell thick. They're that fine. This is an example of a soft tree fern. They grow on these tree ferns, and the tree fern is full of nutrients. So these are actually the roots, sort of fine roots of the tree fern, so they can get their nutrients from the surface of the tree fern. Mount Worth is very much a special place. A lot of people probably don't know about Mount Worth, although it is very visible when you're coming along the highway and you see this big sort of hill sticking up, and that's Mount Worth. And of course it's much closer to Melbourne, so that would be a good reason to come here.
Remember that all flora and fauna in the park are protected by legislation. They cannot be removed or damaged in any way. Take nothing more than photographs and help protect our natural heritage for future generations to enjoy.